thrust of the government's energy policy, and as an exercise in futility, because even if she were to succeed in all her objectives, what we gain in Wales is massively swamped by what's happening in the rest of the world. Meanwhile, the price of this policy is being paid for by the electricity consumers and taxpayers in Wales, and we've just heard the effects which will be felt in the countryside of these wind farms, these excrescences that are being dotted around all over the hills of Wales. I drove down from Aberdyfi through mid-Wales at the weekend, and almost everywhere on the skyline you see these eyesores. And in addition to the points which I totally agree with that have been raised already by Andrew R.T. Davies and Darren Miller, I would like to ask why it is that the Hendy wind farm has been treated in a different way from that at Crowther in Pembrokeshire, where the same considerations, planning considerations, arose. That was only 5 turbines, Hendy is 7. Crowther was turned down on the basis of its visual impact and the effect of the landscape. At Llandegli Rocks, near the Hendy wind farm, you've got unspoilt landscape, scheduled ancient monuments, internationally important paleontology of the Llandegli Rocks. It's the source of the River Edu. There's a huge starling roost there, 2,000 to 3,000 starlings, a conservation species, which the developers plan to fell, and there are listed buildings very close to the site. I agree entirely with the point that Darren Miller made, that the effect upon the landscape, and let's not forget that one of the principal assets of Mid Wales is its tourist potential, the effect on the landscape is wholly disproportionate to the gain in terms of the government's energy policy. It's a relatively small project, and looking at this in a global context, it is totally insignificant. And I can't understand, therefore, why the Cabinet Secretary has decided to allow this to go ahead when it can be of no gain practically to anybody other than the developers themselves. And I don't think that that is a sensible basis upon which governments should take these decisions. But I want to address now the wider considerations that the government's energy policy brings up. Now, it would disappoint the Cabinet Secretary if I didn't mention China in this speech, because she actually constantly points out to me that this is something that I always raise, and she's absolutely right, because I want to make this point again. China has 993 gigawatts of capacity for generating electricity, and they have currently under construction another 259 gigawatts of coal-fired power stations, principally, and that's a 25% increase on their current capacity. That is 6 times the entire generating capacity of the United Kingdom. If we close down the entire United Kingdom economy, of course we would cut our carbon emissions to a very small percentage, but China would, in the course of however long these new power stations take to build, 5 to 10 years, have made up for that reduction by 6 times. So anything that we do in Wales, which is responsible for only a minute fraction of 1% of global emissions, will be completely irrelevant in the debate on global warming. And I'd like to read from a BBC article on its website only in September. Building workers restarted hundreds of Chinese coal-fired power stations, according to an analysis of satellite imagery. 259 gigawatts new capacity under development. So this is something which has achieved considerable publicity, and I think it wholly undermines the whole argument for renewables at vast subsidies which are paid for by ordinary people. And Wales is the poorest part of the United Kingdom. 291,000 households are in fuel poverty, government's own figures. That's 23% of the households in Wales. People can't afford to pay these increases. The Office of Budget Responsibility last spring revealed in its economic and fiscal outlook that environmental levies this year will cost, throughout the United Kingdom, £11.3 billion. That's a rise of £2 billion over the last financial year. And goes on to say the increase of £2 billion represents a rise in average electricity bills of about 5%. So that's twice the rate of inflation. And this is plan to go on and on and on each year for the foreseeable future, until in 2030 it's estimated that at least a third of all electricity bills will be accounted for by environmental levies. So the government's policy is an exercise in futility, and the people who are really paying the price are those at the bottom of the income scale, whom I would have thought the Labour Party would have had an interest in helping.